Hi everyone, my name is Gautam and I'm a member of the education team here at Fremont Debate Academy. In this video, we're going to be discussing the topic, the voting age should be lowered to 16. Let's get started. Here's just a brief overview of what I'm going to be covering in this video. First, I'll be providing some context for this topic, just some definitions and background information, just so we understand how to approach this topic. And then I'll be looking at the proposition and opposition points. Let's start with some context, and more specifically, let's look at just the main definition we should be presenting, which is the definition for the voting age. The voting age is the minimum age that a person must reach in order to vote in elections. And what the first proposition speaker should do is they should specify whether you're talking about a local election, for example, in a city like Fremont, or at the state level, for example, in a state like California, or at the federal level, for example, in a nation like the United States. And the reason why you do this is because it keeps the debate on track and it keeps it specific, which is really important. Now, for some background information, you can just take a look at the first bullet point, and that's just elections in a nutshell. People cast ballots to vote political leaders into office. And another fact you should keep in mind is that throughout history, students have always done their job and they've always made themselves heard in democracies. For example, during the Vietnam War, students and minors, especially in the United States, headed anti-war protests in which they spread pacifist ideas, which just promote peace and go against war and violence. And more recently, in Florida, following the tragic Parkland High School shooting, many students in that area led protests about gun violence, basically just prompting action toward basically addressing gun violence. And another thing to remember is that the United States states do have the jurisdiction to lower the voting age for their own internal elections, not the federal election, but their own internal elections. And along with this, primary elections are used to determine the candidate of representing a political party in an election. So just one question. What is the importance of having your voice heard by policymakers? I want you to just take a second and just think about this question and maybe just pause the video and come back afterward and I'll give you an answer that I had in my mind. Hi, welcome back. So the answer I had in my mind was that voters' daily issues are recognized and addressed by policies. And obviously this would make them have better lives, right? So that's obviously a good thing. So just to keep moving, just to look at current voting ages, in the United States, the voting age right now is 18, which means that if you're 18 years old, you can maybe vote for who you think the president should be for the next term. And as of 2018, 9 countries around the globe allow 16-year-olds to actually vote in all elections. And 3 examples are Austria, Brazil, and Argentina. We'll be bringing back Austria in just 1 second. But just to move over to proposition points, the first point the proposition can argue is that lowering the voting age to 16 increases voter turnout. And the first argument below this, the first reasoning point, I should say, is about habitual voting. And what this means is that if you lower the voting age, that means more of these young people can create the habit of voting and that'll just carry on throughout their life. And what that basically means is that voting at a young age increases the likelihood of voting later on in life, and that increases long-term voter turnout. And another reasoning point you can bring up is the trickle-up effect, in which 16 and 17-year-olds may vote for whatever leaders they care for in elections, and as a result, their parents or guardians will also start to vote a little bit more, which basically just means that in this way also decreasing the voting age is going to increase voter turnout in the long term. And something to recognize is just looking at statistics, there is evidence that when you decrease the voting age, you're going to increase voter turnout. So if you look at Austria and the United States and you just compare them, you'll notice that Austria had a higher voter turnout rate than the United States in 2020. And again, Austria's voting age is 16 and the United States is 18, which is really important because again, this basically just shows that if you decrease the voting age, that's going to mean that more people are going to end up voting in elections. Now, the second point that you can bring up is the point about how decreasing the voting age can increase activism and education. So what you should remember is that nowadays, issues like school shootings and climate change are becoming increasingly common for young people. And young people are going to be the ones on Earth that are going to have to eventually face these issues more and more and more than the older generation. So teenagers worldwide are already being socially active. And one glowing example of this is Greta Thunberg, who is a teenage climate activist. And she was only 15 years old when she started organizing protests to draw attention to inaction toward climate change. And another example is that the March of Our Lives movement in 2018 actually ended up enacting 50 new laws that helped move gun reform forward, which just shows that there's a lot of progress when teenagers are very socially active, which they are being in the status quo or in the current world. And basically, if you allow a lot of 16 and 17-year-olds to vote, it's going to increase activism, and it's going to basically just give these teenagers a greater voice. For example, it's going to increase the number of protests you have, which is a good thing, as we've already seen in the past, because it draws attention toward issues that aren't being addressed, and it's going to basically allow more public pressure to arise, and as a result, these issues will most likely be addressed, and that's a good thing. Now let's move on to some points that the opposition side can bring up. But before we get there, I want to just give you another question. Just think about this. How can social media influence voting habits? I'll just give you 1 second to think about this, and then we'll move on to the first point, where this will be answered. Okay, so the first point that the opposition side can bring up is about the manipulation of 16-year-olds. So 16-year-olds are not as cognitively developed as 18-year-olds or other adults. And what that basically means is, just looking at the word cognitively, cognitive on its own refers to the brain. And what this means is that 16-year-olds' brains are not as developed as 18-year-olds. And according to an article from the NIH, or more specifically NCBI, the development and maturation of the prefrontal cortex occurs at about age 25. And the prefrontal cortex is a part of the brain that is in charge of rational decision making. So it's basically in charge of facilitating impulses and regulating that. And until then, until that age of 25, when brain development is almost always just going to end, the brain is subject to manipulation by anything in its environment. So looking at social media, which we had just talked about in that question, political ads are common on social media, especially around election season. And young people are very large users of social media. 16 and 17-year-olds will often be found more than 18-year-olds on social media, which basically just shows that it's very easy for these political ads to come in and sway their decisions. And as a result, decision making is not going to be completely independent, and instead it's going to be biased. Now, looking at the second point that the opposition side can bring up, and this point is all about the lack of real-world education. 16-year-olds may not actually have the proper real-world experience. For example, things like paying taxes and working aren't responsibilities that are basically faced by all 16-year-olds, whereas adults will more often be facing these types of responsibilities and obligations in their day-to-day life. And it can be argued that these jobs and responsibilities are necessary to vote to represent the American people as a whole. And along with that, most 16-year-olds rely on their parents for financial support and a lot of their important decisions, and they don't have much civic awareness on their own. And just to add on to this with a little bit more evidence, 66% of teenagers live with their parents. And what this means is that they can very easily be influenced and controlled by their parents whenever they're making important decisions. And that can be a good thing, because that could mean that their parents are helping them, but that can also be a bad thing, because their parents can be forcing their own political beliefs onto these 16 and 17-year-olds when they're voting. And just in 2016, a statistic showed that only 26% of students believe civics is actually important, and only 23% performed well on the national civics exam. This essentially demonstrates that students don't have the civics education necessary to vote effectively in all elections that face, I guess, all citizens in any nation. So that's all we had prepared for you. But I just want to remind you that Fremont Debate Academy does not support either side. We're just here to just give a little bit more information on both sides so that you know how to prepare your case. And it also hopefully illuminated the idea that civics education and government education and politics are all really important and interesting fields that you can definitely learn more about with further research. And luckily, Fremont Debate Academy actually has recently started up a civics program where we're basically spreading civics education. And you should definitely check that out on our website. But again, thank you for watching. If you do have any questions, please just leave them below in the comment section. And we'll definitely try our best to get back to you and answer them. And if you enjoyed this video, just feel free to like and subscribe. Again, thank you for watching. Have a good day.